The missing one from 7:10. The fog came in low and heavy over Puget Sound on the morning of November 3rd, 1999. The kind of damp gray that flattened sound and swallowed distance until water and sky became the same indistinct shade. At 7:10 a.m., like it did every weekday, the MV Kitsap eased away from the Bremerton terminal with a low mechanical shudder, its diesel engines vibrating through the steel frame as commuters shuffled to their usual spots. The manifest reflected the same routine precision as any other Wednesday. 214 passengers, 62 vehicles, 11 crew members. The count was logged, initialed, and time-stamped by Assistant Purser Elaine Torres, who'd been working the morning Bremerton-Seattle run for 6 years, and could recite the loading capacity in her sleep. No one noticed the man in the navy windbreaker and worn leather briefcase as anything more than another anonymous commuter blending into the crowd that flowed up the stairwells and into the passenger cabin. He paid with a monthly pass, flashed it without looking at the deckhand, and joined the silent coffee-sipping line at the snack bar. His name was Michael Foster, age 28. A systems analyst for a mid-size logistics software company based in downtown Seattle. At 7:14 a.m., he ordered a black coffee and a day-old blueberry muffin, thanked the cashier in the quiet, distracted way of someone already halfway inside their own head, and moved toward a window seat on the starboard side. The CCTV cameras in the passenger cabin, installed more for liability than security, captured his movements in grainy, time-stamped frames. 07:14:38, Michael passes the trash can. 07:15:02, he sits near the midship window. 07:15:27, he opens his briefcase and removes a yellow legal pad. For the next 40 minutes of recorded time, he barely moves. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the shoreline until the Kitsap might as well have been crossing open ocean instead of the familiar busy waterway between Bremerton and Seattle. Inside, the usual rituals unfolded with clockwork regularity. Business casual professionals scrolled through emails on early model cell phones and pagers. Navy personnel in uniform dozed with arms crossed. A cluster of high schoolers whispered around a shared discman, their laughter dampened by the carpeted walls, the hum of the engines. The Ferry S-horn sounded at regular intervals, long, mournful blasts into the white. At 7:48 a.m., above the invisible waterline, the Seattle skyline began to emerge from the fog, the tops of the tallest buildings appearing first like islands floating in a colorless void. By 7:54 a.m., the dock crews at Coleman Dock were in position, ready to receive the Kitsap. The vessel's approach was textbook, thrusters engaging, lines thrown and caught, the subtle choreography of horns and hand signals and practiced motions that had been repeated thousands of times before. At 7:58 a.m., the ramp dropped with a heavy metallic clatter. The crew followed standard disembarkation procedure. Passengers on foot were released first. Cars held back until the pedestrian traffic cleared. People rose from their seats, collected bags and briefcases, and began the slow shuffle toward the exits. Cameras captured the flow. Aero 7:58:46, the first passengers step off. Aero 8:02:13, the last of the main crowd clears the passenger ramp. It wasn't until 8:07 a.m. when the final walkthrough was conducted by deckhand Roy Peters that the first discrepancy appeared. The rules required a sweep of all passenger areas between runs. Roy moved down the rows of bolted seats, picking up discarded newspapers and empty coffee cups, pushing abandoned chairs back under tables. When he reached the starboard midship window where Michael Foster had sat, he found the coffee cup half empty and gone tepid, still in the plastic holder. The napkin beneath it was neatly folded. There were no crumbs, no muffin wrapper. The seat itself was empty. That wasn't unusual. People moved around the vessel all the time, climbing to the outside decks for fresh air, taking bathrooms breaks, chatting with friends in other sections. Roy shrugged. tossed the napkin and cup into his trash bag, and continued his sweep. In the vehicle deck below, the ritual continued. Engines rumbled to life, exhaust curling in the cold air as a deckhand motioned the first line of cars forward. Among them was a faded green Honda Civic with Washington plates registered to Michael Foster, secured in its parking slot with the manual emergency brake still engaged. The video from the vehicle deck camera showed the cars rolling off in sequence one after another. At 8:10 a.m., a crew member noticed the Civic still in place, a lone vehicle among freshly painted lane markers. The engine was cold. No driver appeared. 3 hours later, at 11:16 a.m., after 2 more round trips without anyone claiming the vehicle, Washington State Patrol contacted the Seattle Police Department. The report that reached the missing persons unit at 3:02 p.m. was clinical but unsettling. Abandoned vehicle on Ferry, owner not located, circumstances unclear. Detective Maggie Rowe read the incident summary twice before setting the paper down. She was 41 years old, 10 years into her career with Seattle PD, with the steady, unremarkable track record of someone who preferred thoroughness to heroics. Most days her work involved domestic disputes, runaway teens, and adults who went missing for a week and then returned with sheepish explanations and new piercings. But something about the Ferry report caught on a rough edge in her brain and refused to let go. The vehicle hadn't been left at the dock overnight. It hadn't drifted in from some remote highway turnout with the door hanging open. It had traveled across Puget Sound on a ferry where every car, every passenger, every crew member was logged, counted, and accounted for. Whichever way you looked at it, someone had started a journey and failed to complete it in a sealed, routine environment. People did not just vanish from ferries in the middle of a well-documented crossing any more than they vanished from locked houses in the middle of blizzards. But Maggie didn't know that parallel yet. All she knew that evening was that there was a car, a name, and a 48-minute gap between boarding and docking that needed explaining. The call to Michael Foster's listed home number went unanswered at 3:27 p.m. A second attempt at 4:02 p.m. yielded the same result. Maggie left a neutral message, careful not to use the phrase police department in case someone else was checking his voicemail. At 4:18 p.m. she dialed the alternate number listed on his employment records, the main line for North Bay Logistics Systems office in Seattle. The receptionist connected her to Human Resources, where a woman with a soft, tired voice confirmed that yes, Michael Foster was an employee, and yes, he was scheduled to be at work that day. He had not arrived. He had not called in sick. He did not have approved time off. No, this was not typical. Michael was, in the woman's words, precise about everything. By 5:06 p.m. the light had already begun to fade outside the precinct windows, the November dusk coming early and fast. Maggie printed the manifest and the preliminary Ferry incident report, stapled them together, and wrote across the top in her compact, no-nonsense handwriting: Foster Michael, possible missing origin, WSF Ferry, 710 Bremerton, Seattle. She hadn't yet decided it was something more than a bureaucratic oddity, but she'd worked enough cases to recognize the specific weight that settled in her stomach when facts didn't line up cleanly. The next steps were procedural. First, confirm movement. Washington State Ferries provided boarding records. Michael's monthly pass had been scanned at 7:09:51. Cameras at the Bremerton terminal caught him entering the pedestrian walkway, recognizable by the Navy windbreaker, the briefcase, and the slightly hunched posture of someone used to smaller spaces and too much screen glare. The next sighting came aboard the vessel itself. The snack bar camera, the time-stamped purchase, his brief, distracted half-smile at the cashier. The hallway camera near the forward stairwell captured him passing by at 07:16:09, coffee in hand, heading toward the starboard seating area. After that, the trail went cold in a way that made no sense. No footage of him on the outer decks. No view of him near the bathrooms. No glimpse of his jacket at the exit doors when passengers disembarked in Seattle. At 07:59:18, the primary cabin camera showed a mass of commuters rising nearly in unison, the movement of bodies in coats and backpacks forming a shifting mosaic of color and motion. If Michael was in that crowd, he left no distinct mark the system could find. Maggie had the tech unit pull still frames, zooming in on every navy blue shape, every dark-haired man of roughly the right height. The results were inconclusive. In low-resolution footage, people blurred into each other. Faces became smudges of pixels. It was like looking for a single raindrop in the middle of a storm. The fastest explanations came first, as they always did. Maybe he'd decided to walk into the sound. Maybe he'd staged his disappearance, left the car as misdirection, stepped off the ferry in the confusion of disembarkation, and started a new life under a different name. Maybe there was a simple, boring explanation, like a medical emergency, and he was lying in a hospital bed somewhere without identification. Maggie had chased all those explanations before, and most of the time one of them turned out to be true. But if experience had taught her anything, it was that the easy answers tended to show themselves quickly. The ones that didn't. Those were the ones that ate up years. At 6:42 p.m., Maggie drove to the address listed for Michael Foster, a small, rented one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a nondescript building in Bremerton, the kind of place that looked identical to 100 others within a 5-mile radius of the naval shipyard. The building manager, a man in his 50s with nicotine-stained fingers and a Seahawks cap, met her in the hallway after she flashed her badge. Yes, Michael lived there. Yes, he paid on time. No, there had never been any noise complaints. Quiet kid, the manager said. Kept to himself. Nice enough. Maggie knocked twice. No answer. The door was locked. Under Washington law, she needed more than a missed day of work and an abandoned car to force entry. She still didn't know if she was dealing with a crime, an accident, or an elaborate misunderstanding. So she did what procedure allowed. Standing in the stale carpet hallway with the faint echo of a TV from another unit bleeding through the walls, she called Michael S. mother. The number came from a next of kin line on an old HR form the company faxed over, the ink faint where it had been copied too many times. The woman who answered in Spokane at 7:11 p.m. had the same last name and the kind of voice that went instantly rigid when a stranger called in the evening and introduced herself as a detective. Maggie noted the sharp intake of breath, the small silence before the word yes. Yes, she was Michael S. mother. No, she had not seen him recently. Yes, they talked, though not as often as she would like. Weekly, sometimes every other week. No, he had not mentioned any plans to travel or move. When Maggie explained carefully that Michael S. car had been found on a ferry in Seattle with no sign of him disembarking, the silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for her to picture the woman gripping the phone, mouthing her son's name like it was a spell that might reverse whatever was happening. He wouldn't do that, his mother said finally, her voice thickening. He wouldn't just go off. He worries about everything. He wouldn't leave his car. He wouldn't miss work. He wouldn't do that to me. Maggie heard the unspoken words behind the spoken ones. He's not that kind of person. He's not irresponsible. He's not cruel. He's mine. She'd heard versions of that same defense from countless parents, lovers, and siblings. Sometimes it was wishful thinking, sometimes it was denial, but sometimes just often enough to matter it was the first glimpse of something true about who the missing person really was beneath the statistics and timelines. She logged the conversation, noted the mother S. insistence on Michael S. reliability, and requested a welfare check on the Spokane address just to be thorough. It would be another line in an expanding file. Back at her desk that night, long after most of the unit had gone home, Maggie spread out the ferry schematics on the table. The Kitsap S-decks were laid out in clean labeled lines: vehicle level, passenger cabin, sun deck, crew areas. Every entry point, every corridor, every stairwell marked in neat ink. She traced possible routes with her finger. Here he boards. Here he buys coffee. Here he passes the stairwell camera. From there, a dozen possibilities branched outward like the arms of a fractal. He could have gone to the outer deck to look at the water, though on a morning like that, few people bothered. He could have gone to the bathroom, which had no interior cameras. He could have spoken with someone who wasn't captured in frame. He could have hidden in one of the crew access corridors, though that would have required knowledge he wasn't likely to have. Or he could have remained sitting in that starboard seat until the last possible moment, then joined the crowd and slipped away unseen, a normal man having a normal day that everyone else had somehow miscounted. The manifest said 214 boarded. The vehicle count, the weight calculations, and the crew's visual estimates agreed. The cameras suggested 213 getting off, but cameras could be wrong. People walked close together. They blocked each other from view. Someone at Washington State Ferries pointed this out with the weary patience of a man who'd sat through too many lawsuits. Manifest counts weren't perfect either. Human error. Clickers and tallies and long shifts made for easy mistakes. It was possible that the morning run had simply miscounted, that the number 214 on the form was a lie without malice, a ghost passenger born from a flicked finger on a mechanical counter. It was possible, but the Honda Civic sitting unclaimed on the vehicle deck was not a miscount. Michael Foster's scanned pass was not a miscount. His mother's voice, fightin' panic 300 miles away, was not a miscount. Somewhere between 07:09 a.m. in Bremerton and 07:58 a.m. in Seattle, something had happened. Whether that something was a deliberate act, an accident, or an intervention by someone else, Maggie didn't know yet. She only knew that the sound was 48 degrees that morning and unforgiving, that the Ferry's safety railings met code, and that no one on board had reported a scream, a splash, or a struggle. Years later, she would look back at that first night and remember the particular stillness of the precinct, the dim glow of her desk lamp on the ferry schematics, and the faint sound of foghorns from the waterfront echoing through the city's steel and glass. She would remember the way her pen hovered over the intake form before she checked the box. Potential foul play. Unknown. At the time, it felt like a neutral choice, an honest one. She didn't yet understand that some cases start with a neat, contained question and then expand, slowly and relentlessly, until they touch things that were never supposed to see daylight. At 10:23 p.m., Maggie closed the file for the night, wrote follow-up interview crew, pull more cameras, contact WSF security on a sticky note, and placed it on top of the Foster folder. She didn't know that this simple act of organization would mark the beginning of a 20-year collision between a commuter's quiet life, a transportation system as fragile routines, and a set of corporate decisions buried deep in server logs that no one had bothered to read in a decade. For the moment, all she had was an empty car, a missing commuter, and a routine ferry crossing that ended one body light. The gap in the footage, Detective Maggie Rowe returned to the waterfront the next morning before sunrise, the November cold biting through her coat as she stepped onto the damp planks of the Bremerton terminal. Fog clung to everything, thick enough that the ferry horns sounded closer than they were, their echoes rolling across the sound like warnings from another world. The Kitsap loomed out of the gray with the slow inevitability of a tide, steel against still water, lights flickering dimly through the mist. Maggie boarded with the first maintenance crew, her badge clipped to her jacket, her notebook already open in her hand. There was no stalling, no easing into the day. She wanted answers before the first commuter even thought about stepping foot on the vessel. The passenger cabin was empty, the air still holding the faint smell of yesterday's coffee and wet wool. She walked directly to the starboard midship window seat where Michael Foster had sat. The plastic seat was wiped clean, reset like every other seat before a new run. Only the faintest ring on the tabletop betrayed that a cup had rested there the day before. Maggie stood in the narrow aisle, turning slowly, mapping the space in her mind. She traced Michael's route, imagining his footsteps, his pacing, his stillness. She walked toward the outer deck door, pushed it open, and stepped into the cold. The metal deck was slick with condensation, a thin sheen that reflected the dim morning lights in scattered patches. She checked the railing height, measuring it against her own body. Adult male, 5'10", average build, no sign of climbing or leaning, no scuff marks, no snagged fabric. She paced the perimeter, stopping at each emergency equipment station. Everything was intact, nothing out of place. The Ferry's chief mate, a man with 32 years at sea and the posture of someone who had never once called in sick, met her near the bow. His name was Howard Howie Brackett, the kind of man who spoke in direct lines and didn't embellish. She appreciated that. He appreciated that she appreciated that. Howie walked her through the standard procedures again. The manifest count, the visual checks, the crew rotation. He tapped his pen against the printed manifest from the previous morning. Elaine Torres, the purser, was certain in her count. She hadn't made an error in 6 years and didn't believe she'd made one now. When Maggie asked about blind spots in the camera coverage, Howie didn't hesitate. Cameras didn't cover the outer decks entirely. They didn't record in the restrooms. There was no camera pointed directly at the stern elevator. Cameras were meant to settle slip-and-fall claims, not solve disappearances. Maggie returned to the passenger cabin and asked to see the onboard security monitor set up. It was an old system, boxy screens housed in a locked cabinet. The crew unlocked it for her, and she watched the feed cycle through. Static washed hallway views, low-resolution snapshots of seating rows, a grainy view over the snack bar counter. When she requested access to archived footage, the crew exchanged looks. Maggie caught it instantly. "What?" she asked. The crew chief cleared his throat and pulled out a maintenance log. The Ferry's recording system, a mix of analog and early digital equipment, overwrote itself every 72 hours unless footage was manually saved. The clip from the day of Michael's disappearance had been pulled, but only partially. One of the tapes had corrupted during transfer, specifically the footage from the aft stairwell, the same stairwell that led from the passenger cabin to the vehicle deck, the same stairwell Michael would have used if for any reason he decided to return to his car mid-crossing. Maggie felt a familiar tightening in her chest, not panic, but the cold rush that came when a pattern started to take shape somewhere just beyond the edges of explanation. She reviewed what remained of the footage again. There was Michael at 07:16:09 heading to the starboard seating area. There was the mass of disembarking passengers at 07:59:18. But between those timestamps, 43 minutes of routine nothingness, Michael did not appear again. It wasn't unheard of. People stayed seated the whole trip, but people didn't vanish quietly from a ferry in fog so thick it muted the world. On the dock, she interviewed deckhands one by one. Everyone remembered the fog. No one remembered a man in a Navy windbreaker. No one recalled anything unusual at all. Routine, they said. Boring day, nothing special. In her experience, nothing special often meant something had been missed. When she left the ferry around mid-morning, the fog had begun lifting in soft, uneven sheets. Seattle appeared on the horizon like a familiar ghost returning to shape. Her next stop was the vehicle processing bay where the abandoned Honda Civic had been stored. The car sat in a dim corner of the lot, condensation clinging to the windshield. Maggie unlocked it, slid into the driver's seat, and breathed in the slightly stale scent, faint aftershave, paper coffee, something like cedar from a cheap air freshener clipped to the vent. Everything was neat, precise. The glove compartment held a small stack of insurance papers and registration documents organized in exact order. The center console contained a single pack of gum and a USB drive. She pocketed the drive without hesitation and continued her search. The trunk held a laptop bag with Michael's work-issued computer. The device was powered off, battery less than half. Maggie tagged it for forensic imaging. She found nothing else. No signs of struggle, no abandoned notes, no wallet left open in panic. It was the car of a man who had expected to return to it. When she closed the trunk, she stood for a long moment staring at the ferry across the water. She could feel suspicion circling, forming, consolidating. Something about this wasn't accidental. Something about this wasn't voluntary. Back at the precinct, forensic techs had already begun pulling the log files from the Ferry's digital counter system. Maggie was looking for one thing: confirmation that the boarding count was accurate. The ferry system used both manual tallies and automated weight calibration. The numbers weren't perfect, but they rarely disagreed by more than a passenger or two. The analyst frowned at the screen. The weights matched 214 passengers almost exactly. Almost. When Maggie pressed, the analyst pointed out a discrepancy so small most people would overlook it. The system weight indicated a difference of approximately 150 to 160 pounds less than one adult passenger with a coat, briefcase, and backpack. The manifest said 214. The system weight suggested 213.5. Not definitive, but enough to make Maggie stop breathing for a moment. Someone had been counted who might not have been physically present, or someone had been present in a way the system hadn't anticipated. She needed to know who Michael had been in contact with prior to boarding. That meant co-workers. That meant neighbors. That meant family. She started with the neighbors in the Bremerton apartment building. A young mother on the first floor remembered Michael as quiet. A retiree on the second floor said he nodded politely in the hallways. No visitors, no late-night noise, no unusual behavior. No one had seen him with anyone in the past week. But the tenant in 3B across from Michael offered something different. He remembered the night before Michael disappeared. He remembered hearing footsteps in the hallway. Not unusual in itself, but at 11:22 p.m. he heard voices. One soft, one whispering, one that sounded like Michael, though he couldn't make out the words. Then a second voice, lower, calmer, someone he didn't recognize. When the neighbor opened his door a crack, the voices stopped. The hallway was empty. Maggie pressed her hands against her notebook, absorbing that detail. Michael had a visitor, someone not on record, someone no one else in the building noticed. She checked the timestamp against ferry schedules, commuter habits, work hours. It fit nothing and everything, a wild card in a clean deck. As she walked back to her car, her phone buzzed. Forensics had finished imaging the USB drive from Michael's console. Only one file was on it, a single text document last modified 2 days before his disappearance. The file name was short and strange. Doc 7. Maggie opened it. It contained 9 lines of text, coordinates, timestamp strings, server pathways, and at the very bottom a phrase that froze her where she stood. They know what I accessed. She reread it twice before the cold wind forced her back into motion. This wasn't a man planning to disappear. This wasn't a man losing control of his routine life. This was a man who had found something in a system he worked with every day, and someone else knew he had found it. Maggie didn't yet know what that something was, but as she drove away from the waterfront, the fog lifting behind her, she understood one thing with stark clarity. Michael Foster had not vanished from the ferry. He had been removed from it. And whoever had done it had counted on the fog to erase everything. The fog had cooperated, the cameras had cooperated, the system had cooperated. But Michael, precise, organized, methodical Michael, had left just enough behind to tell someone one day exactly where to look. And she was now that someone. The access logs detective Maggie Rowe spent the next 48 hours buried in the digital archaeology of Michael Foster's last known days. Her sleep reduced to shallow naps on the precinct couch and the occasional stumble to the break room for bad coffee. She wasn't dealing with a conventional missing person file anymore. She was dealing with a man who had left behind coordinates, timestamps, and server pathways as if he knew he'd have only one chance to send a message before someone silenced him. The USB drive S-Loan document Doc 7 had already been imaged, translated, and fed through every tool Seattle PD's forensic unit had. The coordinates pointed to a very specific location along Seattle's waterfront, a nondescript maintenance access area beneath Pier 52, the same pier used by the Bremerton Ferry line. The timestamps were each precisely 1 minute long, ranging from 02:11:08 to 02:17:08, early morning hours when no ferries were active and when the dock was occupied only by skeleton shift maintenance crews. But the server pathways were the part that made the tech analysts exchange uneasy glances. They belonged to North Bay Logistics Systems, Michael's employer, and referenced internal file structures buried behind credentialed access layers. He was pulling something he shouldn't have, one analyst muttered, scrolling through the reconstructed pathway. Maybe something someone else was already watching. Maggie arranged interviews with Michael's co-workers at North Bay. The glass-fronted office in downtown Seattle was sterile and overly air-conditioned, the kind of place where everything smelled faintly of printer ink and stress. Human Resources tried to steer her toward a conference room and a prepared statement, but Maggie insisted on speaking to the people who actually worked with Michael. That meant software engineers, analysts, and project managers, people who lived in the world of data streams, logistics routing, and network security. Most employees described Michael the same way. Quiet, reliable, methodical, slightly anxious, always early, never confrontational. But one co-worker, a senior systems architect named Ross Lindner, shifted uncomfortably when Maggie mentioned Doc 7. Ross's cubicle was adorned with 2 monitors, stacks of outdated tech manuals, and a half-dead plant that looked like it had been forgotten for months. He was pale, twitchy, and unwilling to make eye contact for more than a second. "Do you know what Doc 7 refers to?" Maggie asked. Ross rubbed his forehead with both hands, exhaling hard. "Not officially." "Unofficially?" Ross lowered his voice. "There were rumors inside the company, internal chatter. We handle routing optimization for shipping companies, freight scheduling, manifest reconciliation, stuff like that." Maggie leaned in. And sometimes we see anomalies. Discrepancies between manifest data and actual cargo weight. Things that don't match. Are you talking about theft?" Ross shook his head violently. No, not theft, not smuggling, something bigger." He swallowed, his throat bobbing. "Michael came to me about a month ago. He thought someone was manipulating data streams coming from the ferry system, not the freight ferries, the commuter ones, Bremerton, Edmonds, Bainbridge. He said the timestamp sequences were wrong. Wrong how? Delayed, altered, replaced, like someone was rewriting boarding data." Maggie felt something cold slide into place. Why would anyone do that? Ross looked around as if expecting someone to be listening. To make a person appear where they weren't, or disappear where they were. A silence hung between them for several seconds, thick as fog. Maggie pressed on. "Did Michael tell anyone else?" Ross shook his head. "No, he was scared. He asked me how to extract logs without triggering the access alerts. I told him not to do it, that someone monitored that system, that if he touched it they'd know." "They?" Ross didn't answer. Instead, he gave a small, hopeless shrug that said everything. Maggie left North Bay with a rising dread clawing at her chest. She called the Washington State Ferries Operations Center next. She needed to know whether the commuter ferry digital logs, particularly those related to manifest counts linked to third-party routing systems. They did. North Bay had been awarded a contract in 1997 to synchronize weight data, manifest tallies, and ticket scanning records across all ferry routes, which meant Michael had literally been inside the digital bloodstream of the ferry system, which meant if someone had manipulated passenger data, he would have seen it, which meant someone might have wanted him to stop seeing it. That afternoon, Maggie visited the Pier 52 maintenance area, the coordinates from the Doc 7 file. The location was beneath the main loading platform, accessible only through a locked metal gate that required both a ferry supervisor's badge and a physical key. Inside was a narrow service corridor running parallel to the waterline, filled with pipes, electrical conduits, maintenance equipment, and the constant reverberation of the sound beneath the planks. The air smelled like a blend of salt, diesel, and damp metal. A maintenance worker escorted her through, unlocking a side door that led to a platform suspended directly over the water. The platform was small, just enough space for two people to stand shoulder to shoulder. There was nothing unusual at first glance, just rusted bolts, peeling paint, and the dark water churning below. But Maggie crouched down and ran her hand beneath the lower railing bar. Her fingers brushed something rough, scratched metal, letters. She angled her phone flashlight. 3 letters had been carved into the underside of the railing. MF, Michael Foster. Maggie straightened slowly, her heart pounding. He had been here. He had left this mark. Not as graffiti, not as vandalism. As proof, as location, as confirmation that what he'd written in the Doc 7 file was real. And someone with access to restricted maintenance areas had confronted him here. Whether before or after the ferry crossing, she couldn't yet tell. As she recorded photos and measurements, her phone vibrated. The digital forensics team had cracked the remaining timestamps in Doc 7. They weren't just times. They were references to specific log entries that had been remotely deleted the day Michael vanished. Deleted by a user with elevated administrative privileges inside the ferry system. The username belonged to a contractor working under North Bay S domain, a contractor who had badge access to maintenance corridors, a contractor who had been on duty during the early morning hours the day before Michael disappeared. His name was Paul Rusk. Maggie froze when she heard the surname. She had just interviewed someone named Ross Lindner, but the name Rusk was familiar for a different reason. She pulled the missing persons database for the Puget Sound region. Her breath caught. 3 years earlier, a young woman named Claire Rusk, Paul's daughter, had gone missing. Incomplete manifest counts. Witness confusion, fog. Maggie didn't believe in coincidences, she believed in patterns. And a pattern was taking shape. Steady and undeniable. She returned to the precinct, prepared to request a warrant for Rusk's devices, home and employment records. Before she could make the call, her email pinged. A mass update from Washington State Ferries. One of the security tapes from the Kitsap had just been restored after deeper digital repair. Not the corrupted aft stairwell footage, but a camera facing the forward starboard deck exit, the same deck area adjacent to where Michael had been sitting. The email included a single screenshot, grainy, fog-muted, time-stamped 07-43-19. It showed a figure, one person standing at the outer starboard deck door, navy windbreaker, leather briefcase, head turned slightly as if listening. And behind him, half a step back, another figure, taller, wearing a hooded rain jacket, face turned away from the camera, hand extended toward Michael's shoulder. Maggie stared at the image until her vision blurred. Michael wasn't he alone. He hadn't walked to the deck. He had been led there, and the person leading him had known exactly where the camera couldn't see. The timestamp sat squarely in the middle of the 43-minute gap. The gap where everything had happened. Maggie printed the screenshot and pinned it to the growing caseboard above her desk. Beneath it, she wrote a single sentence. He never left the ferry on his own. The truth wasn't just in the gaps. It was in the hands guiding him into them. And now she knew where to look next. The man behind the hood. Detective Maggie Rowe didn't sleep the night after the screenshot arrived. She spent the hours between midnight and dawn in the precinct conference room, surrounded by printouts, digital logs, ferry schematics, and grainy still frames arranged like constellations across the table. The image of Michael being led toward the outer deck doorway stayed centered, the hooded figure behind him hovering like an eclipse. The timestamp 7:43:19 circled in red ink stared back at her with quiet accusation. She kept returning to the same brutal truth. He had not walked there alone. Someone with knowledge of blind spots, camera angles, and timing had guided him. Someone who knew Michael wouldn't fight, someone confident enough to move him without fear of witnesses. At 5:17 a.m., she pushed away from the table and drove through the dark streets toward North Bay Logistics Systems. The building was locked, its glass facade reflecting the first hint of dawn. Maggie waited in her car until the first employee badges beeped at the doorway, then approached the front desk. She requested building access logs for the previous 3 months, focusing on after-hours entries. The security officer, bleary-eyed and used to corporate routines far more predictable than homicide detectives, obliged. The logs printed on thermal paper that curled as it exited the machine. Maggie traced her finger down the long list of badge IDs. Patterns emerged quickly. Employees clocking in early, leaving late during sprint cycles, cleaning staff completing their nightly rotations. Tech contractors coming and going during system migrations. One badge ID appeared at odd intervals. PR22, Paul Rusk, contractor, systems infrastructure support. His entries clustered around early morning hours, often between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., well outside normal maintenance windows. And his final entry, 05:12 a.m., the morning of Michael's disappearance, was timed precisely 3 hours before Michael boarded the 7:10 ferry. Maggie circled the entry. She felt the weight of a clock ticking backward, the timeline tightening around an event she could now almost visualize. A man cleaning up digital footprints before dealing with the person who had discovered them. She went next to the Washington State Ferry's administrative office. She walked straight past the secretary holding up her badge and asked for the contractor list linked to North Bay. They brought her a folder, thin, unassuming, but containing the name she already expected. Paul Rusk had privilege-level access to Ferry digital systems, including manifest synchronization, automated weight count logs, and maintenance area badge permissions. He also had clearance to enter maintenance corridors on the docks. He had been the one to sync data the night before Michael disappeared. He had been the one with badge access to Dock 7. He had been the one with a missing daughter, Claire Rusk, vanished from a Bainbridge route ferry in 1996. Maggie felt a slow tightening in her chest. Disappearances didn't happen in isolation. They rippled through the same networks of people, the same weaknesses in systems, the same blind spots no one thought to secure. When she returned to the precinct, she requested everything available on the Rusk family: divorce records, employment files, Claire's missing person report. Claire had been 17 when she vanished. The original file described a foggy morning, a ferry crossing, a missing manifest entry, and a father who insisted the count was wrong. Police at the time had dismissed him. They'd assumed a runaway, an impulsive teen. They hadn't realized Claire's father worked inside the very system they trusted. They hadn't realized he understood the ferry blind spots better than any investigator. Maggie stared at Claire's photo freckles, brown hair, a timid half-smile as the edges of the present blurred into the past. Systems didn't fail in the same way twice by coincidence. People engineered failures. Maggie left the precinct again before noon. This time she drove toward a quiet residential neighborhood in Port Orchard, where the Rusk family had lived for more than 20 years in a house that sagged slightly under the weight of old grief. The yard was unkempt, the bushes overgrown, but the blinds on the front windows were perfectly aligned. Someone inside still cared about appearances. She walked up the path and knocked. The door opened halfway, secured by a chain. The woman behind it had tired eyes and hair pulled into a loose knot. "Mrs. Rusk?" Maggie asked. The woman hesitated, her gaze flicking down to the badge just long enough to confirm what she feared. "Yes." The chain slid free. "It is about Claire, isn't it?" "It is connected," Maggie said carefully. Inside, the house smelled of dust and stale air. A single framed photo of Claire sat on a mantel, flanked by 2 unlit candles. The walls held no other pictures, no family portraits, no holidays, no new memories. It felt like time had stopped the day Claire vanished. "Is your husband home?" Maggie asked. Mrs. Rusk's face tightened. Paul hasn't lived here in years. When did he move out? After Claire disappeared, he couldn't. Her voice faltered. He was obsessed. He blamed the ferry system. He blamed the cameras, the manifest counts. He blamed the fog. Did he ever talk about tampering with ferry data? Or going back to the terminals? The woman's eyes widened. He did more than talk. He spent entire nights sitting in front of the TV watching live ferry feeds. He took photos of the screens. He printed manifests that weren't even public. He broke into the maintenance docks once security brought him home. I begged someone to help him, but no one listened. Maggie leaned forward. Mrs. Rusk, did Paul ever mention a place called Dock 7? The woman closed her eyes. Yes, it was a whisper, barely audible. What is it? It is where he last saw Claire. Maggie's throat tightened. Saw her how? She was standing on the lower deck, fog everywhere. He waved to her from above, but she didn't wave back. She just stared at the water. Silence stretched between them until Mrs. Rusk's voice broke again. He ran down the stairs, but she was gone. No splash, no scream, just gone. Maggie felt something cold settle in her core. Two people lost from ferries. One father with system access. One man discovering data anomalies. One hooded figure leading another to the blind spot where cameras didn't reach. She stood abruptly. I need to find Paul. Mrs. Rusk shook her head. You want to find him at home. He sleeps wherever the ferries aren't. He's afraid of the terminals now. Where does he go? The woman hesitated, then exhaled. Try Harper Pier. Harper Pier was 20 minutes south, an old wooden structure stretching into the Sound. Maggie drove fast, her breath fogging the windshield with each exhale. When she arrived, the pier was quiet, waves slapping softly against the support beams. She walked the length of it, scanning shadows, boots thudding against old planks. Halfway down, she spotted him, a tall man in a faded rain jacket, hood up, hands pressed against the railing as he stared across the water. Even from a distance, she recognized the posture from the screenshot. Maggie approached slowly. Paul, he didn't turn. You shouldn't have come, he said. His voice was low, frayed. Why not? They'll see you. They always see. Maggie stopped 2 paces. Behind him. I need to talk about Michael Foster. Paul's shoulders tensed, his fingers curled against the railing. He looked at things he shouldn't have. What things? The gaps. His voice trembled. There are always gaps. Did you meet him on the ferry? Silence. Thick, heavy. I tried to save him, Paul whispered. Maggie's heartbeat slammed into her ribs. Save him from what? Paul finally turned. His face was gray, eyes hollow but lucid. A man pulled thin by years of grief and obsession. From the thing that took Claire. The breath left Maggie's lungs. Paul, she said carefully. What took Claire? He leaned closer. Too close. His voice a shaking thread. It rides the fog. Maggie felt the boards beneath them creak. She felt the wind shift. She felt the water move in a way that didn't match the rhythm of the waves. Paul raised a trembling hand and pointed across the Sound toward the ferry routes. It took him too, he whispered. It took Michael. Then he stepped back from Maggie, eyes glassy with fear. You have to stop looking. Why? Because once you look into the gaps, his voice broke into a shuddering breath. The gaps start looking back. And in that moment, before Maggie could speak, before she could reach for her weapon or her radio or even fully process the meaning of his words, she realized Paul wasn't alone on the pier. Someone else stood at the far end, a silhouette, still, watching. Same height as the hooded figure behind Michael. Same posture, same shape, and the fog behind them rolled in thicker, faster, like something arriving or returning. The silhouette didn't move. Paul's eyes widened in terror. It found you, he whispered. Then the fog swallowed everything. The retrieval team. The fog closed in so fast that Detective Maggie Rowe could no longer see the end of the pier, only the dark blur where the silhouette had been standing moments earlier. Paul Rusk stepped backward until his spine hit the railing, breath coming in jagged bursts. Eyes locked on the thickening gray that pressed against the planks like a living thing. Maggie drew in a slow breath, resisting the instinct to reach for her weapon. Paul's terror was too raw, too rehearsed, the reflex of a man who had lived inside this fear for decades. Paul, she said quietly, who else is here? But he didn't answer. Couldn't answer because the fog shifted again. No wind, no temperature drop, just a smooth, unnatural glide, like curtains pulled along invisible tracks, and the silhouette at the far end of the pier reappeared in the same position it had held seconds before, neither moving nor acknowledging them. Maggie took one step forward. The silhouette dissolved. She took another. It reformed behind her. She froze. Paul whimpered. Something wasn't right with distance. Something wasn't right with perspective. Something wasn't right with the way the figure resisted being fixed in place by her gaze. She forced herself to keep her voice steady. Paul, look at me. Focus on me. But Paul's body was rigid, trembling. It followed you here, he whispered. It followed Michael. It followed Claire. It follows anyone who notices the wrong numbers. Maggie swallowed hard. What numbers? The miscounts. His voice cracked. The missing half-person. The passenger who's there and not there. The weight that doesn't match. The timestamp that shifts a second each time you check it. That's how it starts. Maggie kept her eyes on him. Tell me what happened to your daughter. Paul closed his eyes as if the memory was not just painful but corrosive. She saw a mistake in the boarding logs. She asked me about it. She wanted to help fix it. His breath shook. The next morning she disappeared from the Bainbridge ferry. No footage, no splash, no scream, just subtraction. Fog swallowed the space between them. When it thinned again, the silhouette stood 3 feet away, close enough to touch. Maggie's hand went to her holster. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't speak. For a moment she wondered if it even existed or if the fog itself was shaping shadows into something sentient. Then a voice broke through the haze, sharp, impatient, real. Detective Rowe. Maggie jerked around. 2 men in dark jackets emerged from the fog, their posture too upright, their equipment too polished to be ordinary patrol. Federal, she thought immediately, or something adjacent. The taller one stepped forward, badge flicking open under the pier as weak lights. Agent Nathan Kessler, DHS Maritime Systems Division. Maggie, didn't he lower her guard? You are DHS Subdivision, he corrected. We specialize in transportation data integrity, cyber-physical anomalies, ferry systems included. His eyes swept the pier quickly, landing on Paul, then scanning the fog behind them as if expecting something specific to emerge. We need you to step away from Mr. Rusk. Paul flinched and pressed himself harder against the railing. No, not them. They knew before anyone. Maggie positioned herself slightly in front of him. He is a witness. He is compromised, the other agent said. Younger, cold voice. He's been interacting with classified system discrepancies for years. You have no idea what he has exposed himself to. Maggie narrowed her eyes. He has exposed himself to grief and incompetence. That's not a crime. Kessler's jaw flexed. Detective, you don't understand what you're looking at? Then explain. Not here. Maggie took a slow, deliberate breath. This is now an active investigation connected to a missing person case. You don't have jurisdiction to remove my witness. Kessler didn't blink. We do when the data involves federal transportation infrastructure. This isn't about infrastructure. Maggie stepped closer. It's about people. Everything is about infrastructure, Kessler replied, even people. The younger agent's hand drifted toward Paul's arm. We need to take him in. Paul recoiled violently. No, I didn't tell her anything. I didn't show her anything. She found it herself. Kessler shot him a warning glare. Mr. Rusk, do not talk. Maggie's pulse skipped. Why? Kessler hesitated for the first time. A crack in the mask. Because the ferry system hasn't had a true passenger miscount since 1983. Maggie stared at him. That is impossible. Have you seen the logs? No, Kessler corrected. You've seen the logs someone wanted you to see. The fog surged again, swallowing the silhouette entirely. Maggie felt the boards under her feet tremble faintly, as if something large moved beneath the pier. Paul's breathing quickened into panicked gasps. It is here, he whispered. You brought it. Maggie reached for her radio, but Kessler's hand shot out, gripping her wrist. If you transmit, it triangulates the signal. What does? His eyes flicked toward the water. Whatever keeps taking people. The younger agent moved fast, too fast. He seized Paul's arm and hauled him away from the railing. Paul screamed a raw, primal sound that sliced through the fog. The silhouette reappeared farther down the pier now, but facing them, watching. Maggie drew her weapon. Let him go. The younger agent didn't stop pulling Paul toward the pier entrance. Detective, stand down. He's my witness. He is contaminated. That word sent a chill down Maggie's spine. Contaminated. As if this wasn't a missing person case. As if this was something else entirely. She stepped between them. He is coming with me. No, Kessler said firmly. He is not. Paul twisted in the agent's grip, eyes wild. Detective, listen, there's a pattern in the gaps. Look at the weight logs. Look at the manifest deltas. Look at the second that disappears. Every time someone goes missing, a second disappears. Maggie froze. The Doc 7 timestamps, the Ferry logs, the missing frame video, all of them shortened by 1 second every time she checked them. 1 second not lost, removed. Deliberately, Maggie spoke quietly, urgently. Paul, what happens to the missing second? His answer came broken, terrified. That S when it takes them. Kessler cursed under his breath. That S enough. What takes them? Maggie demanded. Kessler didn't answer. Paul did. Not a person, he whispered. Not anymore. And then the pier shuddered, hard, like something massive bumped its supports from below. The fog thinned for just an instant, long enough for Maggie to see something move beneath the surface of the water. Not an object, not an animal, a distortion, a displacement in the water shaped like an absence rather than a presence gliding parallel to the pier. Paul screamed again. The younger agent tightened his grip. We were leaving, he snapped. Kessler glared at Maggie. Detective Rowe, walk away now. This is bigger than you. She didn't move. Kessler's voice dropped to a razor-edge whisper. You are investigating something that doesn't want to be known. And then the silhouette appeared behind Maggie. Close enough that she felt the air shift. She spun, gun raised, nothing, just fog. Behind her, Paul convulsed and collapsed as if struck by something unseen. The younger agent hauled him up. Move. Maggie stepped forward. Kessler blocked her path. Detective, if you follow this any further, you want to find Michael Foster. His eyes darkened. You will join him. The fog swallowed them all as they dragged Paul toward the parking lot, leaving Maggie alone on the pier, weapon shaking in her hand, the water below pulsing with a slow, unnatural rhythm. And somewhere in the haze, unseen but unmistakably present, something watched her. Something that had watched Michael. Something that had watched Claire. Something that was now waiting for her to look back. The second that vanished. The fog clung to her for the rest of the day. Even after leaving Harper Pier, even after the DHS agents and Paul Rusk vanished into the white curtain like a scene rewound into nothing, Detective Maggie Rowe felt the weight of a presence pressing against her back. She drove to the precinct with both hands locked around the steering wheel, knuckles pale, pulse too loud in her ears. She kept checking her mirror, not for headlights. She saw none, but for a shape walking where no sidewalk existed. When she stepped into the precinct conference room, the fluorescent lights felt unnaturally harsh. The fog clung to her clothes even here, a dampness that seemed to follow her indoors. She shut the blinds, locked the door, and spread the Ferry schematics and digital logs across the table again. Her hands shook slightly. Everything she knew, every rule of procedure, every assumption of cause and effect had been built around the idea that missing meant taken by people, by intention, by crime. But now she had seen something move beneath the pier with no shape, no mass, just displacement. Something that left no trace except absence. And she had been told by a federal agent that if she continued, she would join them. She whispered to the empty room, "Then show me." The missing second. That phrase had lodged in her brain like a splinter. Every log she had reviewed, every manifest timestamp, every boarding count file, every preserved camera segment showed micro shifts. One missing second, always at the moment closest to the disappearance event. She reopened the Doc 7 file and spread the timestamps across her notes. 02-1108, 02.1208, 02.1308, each exactly 1 minute apart, each pointing to a log entry that had later been erased. She highlighted them. According to the metadata, the logs were removed by a user logged in as PR212 Paul Rusk, but the deletion times were wrong, out of sequence, impossible. They had been deleted before they were created. Maggie leaned back, breath catching in her throat. Something was rewriting time inside the system, not metaphorically, not figuratively, literally, removing the record of an event that had occurred. She checked the Ferry S CCTV from Michael S. crossing again. At 07:43:19 the frame, with the silhouette and Michael. At 07:43:18 the frame before it. At 07:43:20 the frame after. She stared closely. Frames 07:43:19 wasn't T-sharp, not just low resolution disrupted as if the pixels had been bent. The figure behind Michael was wrong, distorted, like a shape trying to hold form in a system that couldn't fully render it. Maggie exhaled slowly. What are you? But the more terrifying question followed immediately. Where do you take them? She logged into the Ferry system using a temp account from the operations office. The manifest logs for Michael S. run opened easily. The count for 7:10 a.m. Bremerton, Seattle, 2:14. She cross-referenced the automated weight log. It showed the anomaly again, approximately 160 pounds unaccounted for. The system had counted someone who wasn't physically present, or someone present who took no weight. She clicked into the boarding video from Bremerton. She watched the doors, the lines, the crowd. She slowed it. She watched every body passing the scanner. Then she saw it. The scanner beeped once quiet. Normal but no human passed through. A space in the crowd. An absence. The scanner recognized a pass swipe from a card not assigned to any manifestable identity. A ghost pass. A non-person. The gap in the crowd moved with the flow of humans without disturbing them, like a shadow being pushed forward by their bodies yet untouched by their mass. Maggie slammed her hand against the table. That S, the missing passenger. She rewound it, watched it again. The absence moved toward the ferry. She followed it frame by frame. The absence boarded. The scanner registered it, but the camera did not. On weight logs, it counted as 0. On staff tallies, it counted as 1. Michael Foster had boarded with 213 other people, and something else. She pulled the vehicle deck camera feeds. At docking, the absence left, alone, without Michael, without weight, without record. It rides the fog, Paul had said. Maggie clenched her jaw. No, it rides the system. Someone knocked sharply on the conference room door. Maggie jumped. She holstered her weapon but kept a hand on it. Who is it? It is Donna. Forensic tech. Trusted. Maggie opened the door. Dana stepped inside holding a tablet, her expression stiff. You need to see this. She closed the door behind her. We tried reconstructing corrupted ferry frames from Michael S. Crossing. The restoration software rebuilt 12 of them. But frame 07:43:19, this one. She handed Maggie the tablet. The image was broken, pixelated, but visible. Michael, the silhouette behind him. Maggie zoomed in. The distortion around the silhouette rippled outward like water. Pixels bent inward around the figure like gravity pulling them into a void. Dana whispered, "There's no human heat signature on that figure." Maggie felt her blood go cold. What? No thermal data. Nothing. It is not warm. It is not cold. It is nothing. Maggie stared harder. The silhouette as outlined flickered along the edges of the frame as if it was never fully inside the camera swirled. Then she saw something she hadn't noticed before. Michael's shadow, cast faintly along the wall. But the silhouette behind him cast none. Dana, I know. Did you run this through brightness filters? Yes. Contrast? All of them. Edge detection? Every tool we have. Does it show anything? Dana shook her head slowly. Only what you see. Maggie swallowed. What did the feds say about this? They tried to delete the request logs for your pull. Maggie's breath halted. They what? But I intercepted the request. Wrote a false confirmation. They think your files are gone. Maggie stared at her colleague. Dana's voice dropped to a whisper. Whatever this is, they don't want us looking at it. Maggie sat heavily, her heart hammered, sweat formed cold at her temples. Dana, I need the missing second. Dana blinked. What? Every disappearance corresponds to one missing second of footage or log data. I need to know what S inside that second, the one we never see. Dana hesitated. We can interpolate between frames. We can reconstruct motion paths. It won't be perfect. Do it. Dana worked fast, pulling the frames surrounding 074319 and initiating temporal interpolation. The software began calculating estimated movement inside the gap, a visual guess where no data existed. The rendering built slowly, line by line. When it finished, Dana's face went pale. Maggie stared. The interpolated frame showed Michael stepping toward the deck door, and behind him not the silhouette. Not a person, but a distortion, a hole in the shape of a human, a vacancy shaped like a man, pixels bent inward toward it as if sucked into the absence, a gravity of nothing, a human void. Maggie felt her throat tighten. Dana whispered, "It's like something was wearing the shape of a person," Maggie whispered back, "or replacing one." She reached toward the screen and tapped the void shape. This is what took him. Dana nodded. Whatever it is using the system, hiding in the blind spots, right in the missing second. Maggie leaned back, staring at the impossible frame. The ferry didn't lose a passenger, she said slowly. The ferry gained one, and then lost him. Her phone vibrated violently on the table. "Unknown number," Maggie answered. A low voice rasped through the speaker, shaking with fear. "Detective Rowe?" She froze. "Who is this, please? You don't know me. Then how did you—" "I am on the ferry." Maggie's pulse spiked. "Which ferry?" "The Seattle to Bremerton. The 6:30 run. What is happening?" The voice cracked. "The count is wrong." Maggie stood so fast her chair toppled. "How many?" A trembling breath. "We boarded with 202 and now there are 203. The line crackled. "Something here." Maggie grabbed her coat and keys. "Stay where you are. Don't move." The voice whispered one last thing before the line went dead. "Detective, the fog followed us inside," and the call ended. Maggie stared at her dead phone screen, then at the impossible image on the tablet. The missing second had come back, and it was happening again, this time live. The passenger that returned. Maggie was already moving before her mind fully caught up, coat half on, badge clipped crooked, keys clenched in her fist as she tore out of the precinct and into the November night. The air outside was still, unnaturally still, as if the wind had been muted. She drove toward the Seattle ferry terminal with her hazard lights flashing, weaving between cars while her thoughts pounded harder than the engine. 202 passengers boarded. 203 now. The same signature, the same anomaly, the same impossible subtraction masquerading as addition. The fog thickened as she approached the waterfront, rolling low across Alaskan Way in slow, deliberate waves that did not match the weather report she heard minutes earlier. It was as if the sound itself was exhaling. She parked illegally, sprinted across the terminal plaza, and flashed her badge at the startled attendant. "Which slip is the 6:30 coming in on?" "Slip 3, detective. Are you supposed to—" She didn't wait. She ran. As she reached slip 3, the ferry's horn sounded a long, hollow note that trembled through the fog like a warning. The vessel's lights appeared first, blurred halos shimmering in the gray. Then the bulk of the ferry emerged, gliding with eerie silence toward the dock. No engine rumble, no water churn, just the massive structure sliding in as if pulled by unseen hands. Maggie felt her stomach twist. She stepped onto the ramp before it fully lowered, ignoring protocol, ignoring the shouts of crew. The metal thudded beneath her boots. The ferry doors opened. The interior lights flickered once. She stepped inside. Immediately she sensed it. The air was wrong, too cold, too still. Too full of something that wasn't air. The passenger cabin looked normal at first glance, coats, backpacks, commuters shifting restlessly, but the silence was crushing. No conversation, no footsteps, no hum of human presence. They were all looking in the same direction. Maggie followed their gazes toward the starboard seating area. One man stood there, alone, or rather stood in isolation. People had moved away from him without realizing it, leaving a perfect radius around his body as if some instinct drove them back without conscious thought. He didn't face them. He didn't face Maggie. He faced the window. The fog outside pressed against the glass like a living membrane. Maggie approached carefully, one step at a time. "Sir?" No response. "Sir, Seattle PD, I need you to turn around." The man moved. slowly, mechanically, as if remembering the steps required to mimic a human turning. His face entered view. Maggie's pulse stopped. It was Michael Foster. His eyes were open, looking at her, but empty, no recognition, no fear, no consciousness. Just static behind his gaze. His skin was pale, almost gray. His clothes were the same he had worn the day he vanished Navy. Windbreaker, rumpled shirt, but they were dry despite the fog beating on every other passenger. "Michael," Maggie whispered, "you're alive." He blinked once, slowly, too slowly. Behind him, the window glass warped, bent inward. Maggie felt it before she saw it, a subtle pressure in the air, a low hum, a distortion like the world inhaling. The passengers closest to her backed away, hands covering their mouths, eyes wide with animal-level panic. Maggie grabbed Michael's arm gently. It was cold, not cold like weather, cold like absence, like touching a place where something should be. "Michael, can you hear me?" His mouth opened. No breath escaped. His jaw worked once. Then he spoke in a voice that was not a voice, flat monotone, each syllable separated by an impossibly small pause. "Detective Rowe." Maggie's skin crawled. "Michael, what happened to you?" His eyes flickered like broken screens. "They are counting." Maggie tightened her grip. "Who?" A microsecond lag. "You saw them." The silhouette? Another flicker. Not silhouette. His jaw stiffened. His pupils dilated unevenly. Shadow. A shadow of what? Not shadow of. His head tilted with an unnatural jerk. Shadow on. The lights overhead flickered. Passengers gasped. Something moved behind the window, no shape, no figure, just water bending upward as if something beneath it rose toward the surface. Maggie stepped in front of Michael, blocking the view. "Michael, did it take you into the water?" His chest rose in a slow, painful movement. "Not water. Then where?" His next words were quieter. "Between." She froze. "Between what?" "You will join soon." "No, I want to. You're coming with me. We are getting you out." His entire body trembled. Not violently, rhythmically, the way a compass needle trembles near a magnetic anomaly. His hand lifted slowly and pressed something into her palm. A folded square of Ferry map paper. Maggie looked down. Handwritten across it were numbers, more coordinates, more timestamps. "Kept record," Michael said. "Tried to leave trail." Maggie swallowed the rising panic. "Good. We can follow this. We can figure out what happened." His next blink lagged by a full second. "Detective, I am here. I did not come back." The floor dropped in Maggie's stomach. "Michael, you're standing in front of me. I am placeholder. For what?" "For what left." The water outside bulged again, this time visibly. A concave ripple, not outward but inward, like the surface bending toward something beneath. Passengers screamed. The overhead lights died. For a moment, total darkness swallowed them. In that darkness, Maggie heard whispers, not in the air, not in the cabin, but from everywhere. Counting, counting up, counting down, counting something that was not numbers at all. When the lights returned, Michael's face had changed. His mouth relaxed, his eyes softened, as if his true self broke through for one final instant. "Run," he whispered. Maggie grabbed him by the arm and pulled, but his body locked, rigid, unmovable, as if anchored to the floor by unseen weight. "Michael, come on, I cannot cross." His voice was his own now, broken, human. "I am not whole." The fog outside surged violently, the window cracked, hairline fractures radiating outward. Maggie stepped back, shielding him. The glass bulged inward, bent by invisible pressure. Then it shattered, not outward, inward. Fog and cold spilled into the cabin. Passengers screamed and ducked. The ferry lurched. Maggie shielded her face. When she looked again, Michael was gone. Not pulled, not dragged, gone. In his place was the absence, an indentation in the air, a distortion shaped like a man. Slowly it lifted, as if rising, as if returning to the place between. Maggie backed away, heart pounding so hard she felt it in her teeth. Her phone buzzed violently. A text. Unknown number. One sentence. A warning. "Stop looking or you will complete the count." She looked around, breath shaking. The ferry cabin was chaos, people crying, shouting, stumbling away from the shattered window. But none of them looked at her. None of them saw what she had seen. And above the chaos, the fog receded as if satisfied, as if it had retrieved what it came for. Maggie clutched the folded paper Michael, or whatever remained of him, had given her. Coordinates, timestamps, and at the bottom, in trembling handwriting, One day the count will finish. She closed her eyes, feeling tears she didn't remember forming. The ferry horn sounded once more. Low, long, final. The investigation into Michael Foster's disappearance was officially over, but the passenger count was not. And Detective Maggie Rowe now understood the truth. You don't solve a case like this. You survive it, and pray the next ferry crosses with the same number of souls it leaves with.